For a Honda fanboy like me, the arrival of a new Civic Si is always something to celebrate, to see what Honda's latest and greatest sport compact, one of the OGs in the segment, is up to. And I remember being on the launch event for the 10th generation of the previous model when it debuted for 2017 and being really impressed at Honda's first step into its turbocharged era. However, there were a few weak spots with that car, and Honda says this 11th generation model, which takes much of its hardware from its predecessor, improves upon a lot of key areas. Though, it does raise a few question marks, especially when you look at the stats on paper. But Hondas have always been more than their sums or their numbers, so let's get behind the wheel of this new Si and see how it really drives. Before I can do my full-on nerdy deep dive into the new Si, let's talk about the basics first. Base price, $28 grand, and really there are no options with the Si beyond this optional Blaze Orange Pearl paint, which is $395, and an optional $200 surcharge for high-performance summer tires versus standard all seasons. This tester is $28,910 as tested, very reasonable in the modern sport compact arena. Under the hood, we have a 1.5-liter Turbo 4, which has been notably revised from the previous 10th gen Civic. They've changed the tuning, the exhaust, the turbocharger, and crucially added a much lighter flywheel for sharper responses. Surprisingly, power drops to 200 horsepower and 192 pound-feet of torque. That's 5 less horses than the old Si, and that means the Civic Si has been producing 200 horsepower for what, like almost 20 years now? Beyond that, the chassis is typical modern Honda Civic. McPherson strut up front and independent multi-link rear. It's pretty much the same recipe since, well, my FA5 over 15 years ago. With that out of the way, let's do the important thing. Let's go driving. So, sad to say, but when I first drove this new Si, I have to admit I really didn't care for it. The L15 Turbo is a practical engine, but it's an economy-minded engine. It is the same basic engine you get in other Civic models. It doesn't feel that special at first glance. I would say the big change for driving dynamics compared to the previous Si is that much lighter flywheel compared to its predecessor. The 10th gen Civic had some of the worst rev hang imaginable, which is when you clutch in to change gears and the revs just linger forever. It's very annoying waiting for those revs to drop because it means you have to shift really slowly or you end up with a really clunky shift because you don't match the revs properly. Very annoying. There is still some rev hang. It's an inevitability with the Si, but it is much, much better, much easier to drive every day, especially at low revs. The change in the power band is pretty noticeable too. Honda says peak torque comes in at just 1800 revs now, which is well and dandy, but the big change is the fact that this thing now makes power all the way up to the 6500 RPM redline, where it didn't do that in the 10th gen. It seems like power kind of plateaus around 5 to 5.5, kind of just maintains all the way to 6,500, but it does make for a more flexible powertrain. And I would suspect that in the real world, this thing will be faster than a 10th gen Civic because of that wider power band. I also like that you can hear the bypass valve from the turbo when I lift off the gas. It's kind of cool hearing the turbo go pew. But on the subject of noise, Honda has employed both hardware and software changes to make this thing sound better. They completely revised the exhaust. They said the new mufflers in this thing are much freer flowing. And they've also employed Honda's active sound control technology, which a lot of enthusiasts hate on most cars, and this will be no exception. It's basically when you knock the drive mode switcher down here into sport mode, they pump in an artificial noise into the cabin through the speakers. And I have to say that unfortunately you're gonna have to live with active sound control, because with ASC off, this thing really doesn't make that much noise behind the wheel. Unfortunately, it's still a very muffled turbocharged 4-cylinder anonymous sound. An aftermarket exhaust will definitely be a high priority for enthusiastic drivers out there. Though with the lighter flywheel and crucially this shifter, which is fantastic. It's so tight and so precise. It does make for an overall much nicer package to drive, both everyday at low speeds and up here in the canyons when you're thrashing on it a bit harder. It also helps that this 6-speed manual still has a helical limited slip diff, putting power down to the front wheels. And this thing actually does pretty good burnouts if that's what you're into. What's interesting is that Honda has stressed with this 11th gen Civic that the big deal is with the chassis. The chassis is so good, the limits are so high. Are they? Well, that's where you start to notice some of the weak spots of the 11th gen Civic. The 10th gen famously was amazingly well contented. It had all these amazing premium features you'd never seen in a vehicle at that price point, and one of those features that I really loved were the adjustable dampers. When you change the drive mode selector, the dampers would soften or firm up and really did change the personality behind the wheel. Unfortunately, Honda got rid of those to save costs and also gatekeep you from having that feature so they could put it in the new Acura Integra and make it sound more premium. That's very annoying. Still, the fundamental bones, mixed strut up front and a multi-link rear means this thing does handle pretty well. What's really annoying is that this has non-defeatable traction and stability control. Sure, it says I have VSA off right now, but as soon as you push this car beyond about 7 to 8 tenths, it reins you in really hard and is very, very annoying. I'm sure there's some Konami code to actually turn it off, but it's very frustrating that when you turn things off, they're still on in the background, reining in your fun. Oh, hi there. It's your boy, just checking in. Are you enjoying the video so far? Well, of course you are. That's because this is some grade A primo content we're talking about. So go ahead and show your support by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. It's free and helps the channel. All right, back to the video. The SI may feel a bit pushy compared to previous Civics that were more on their toes, but the reason for that is simple. This has a much firmer suspension out of the box. A lot of the suspension bushings were cribbed from the 10th gen Civic Type R, so much stiffer bushings in the control arms, for example, reduce deflection and make the steering feel more direct. But I want to get back to how firm the ride quality is in this thing. Because Honda got rid of the adjustable dampers, you were kind of stuck with this ride quality whether you like it or not. But the upside is this has notably less roll and is much more direct compared to previous Civic models as a result. I mean, comparing this thing to my 8th gen Civic or even a 9th gen Civic Si, the difference is huge. This is so much more direct as a result. And so while it may not be quite as playful, I'm sure it is ultimately quicker if that's your thing. But when you back off, what about the day-to-day stuff? Because the Civic Si has always been that fun, reliable, everyday driver. And so this needs to perform when you're not thrashing it, but when you are just driving it every day. And one of the huge perks of the powertrain is the fuel efficiency, because this thing blows my old Civic, frankly, out of the water. The EPA rates this combination at 27 mpg city, 37 mpg freeway, and 31 mpg combined. Is a 1 mpg bump over the 10th gen and about a billion mpg bump over my old K20 Civic Si. For what it's worth, before I came up here into the canyons to absolutely thrash this thing, I had an indicated 32 mpg on the display, which is pretty impressive. And what do you think about the looks? At first I was like, well, it's a bit sedate, but then I remembered that Civic Si's, and especially Si sedans, have kind of always been that way. They've always been just a bit more turned up than the regular Civic. Just enough an enthusiast would look at this and know it's an Si, but it doesn't blow your face off like the old Civic Type R does. So in that way, I think they kind of nailed the styling. It has the black trim, 18-inch wheels, a higher rise spoiler, a lower ride height, and it does stick out just enough for the people that know they will know. So when you aren't driving aggressively and just driving it every day, it does pretty well, because look at this interior. I'm 6'1" and I have tons of headroom, tons of legroom, and it's the same deal for the back seat. I do fit in the back seat, and with 14 cubic feet in the trunk, hey, that's pretty good too. Beyond that, because there are no options, what you see is what you get. It has Bose audio, this updated infotainment display with wireless Apple CarPlay and wireless Android Auto, and works quite nicely. I'm going to name a few more features the new Civic Si doesn't have. You're going to find this very annoying, or at least I found this very annoying. The 10th Gen Si had heated seats. This one does not. The 10th Gen Civic Si had dual zone climate control. This does not, along with the aforementioned adjustable shocks. But one of the most annoying features this new Civic Si does not have is any sort of temperature gauge in this gauge cluster. Are you kidding me? There's a little idiot light that comes on a cold start with a blue warning saying engine cold that turns off literally within 20 seconds. It's completely useless. I know Honda's never been great about instrumentation on their cars, but getting rid of a water temp gauge in the Si is unacceptable. But what about other modern cars? Well, that's where things get very interesting, because I recently drove the revised Kia Forte GT. I have a video on my channel from the 2021 model, but I also reviewed the 2022 model, and that is a car that directly goes up against this sedan, 1.6T engine, and sport suspension, and all that stuff. And I think for an everyday driver, it's actually better than the Si, which is a bit embarrassing because it's also less expensive and more contented. And also you can get it with a dual clutch automatic if that's your thing as well. But if you don't care about the luxuries, there are also things like the Subaru WRX, which sure is ugly with those plastic fender flares, but man, for not much more money, you're pretty much the same cash as this. It has a ton more power and all-wheel drive. Though, I'm going to toss an oddball choice out here and say that if you can swing the 29 grand or so required to buy a Civic Si and you consider yourself a car enthusiast and you don't go test drive a Toyota GR86 instead, I think you're really shortchanging yourself. Sure, it's a bit less practical than the Civic, but man, it is so much more fun every day for the same money. And so, overall, much like the 10th Gen Civic, the 11th Gen's a pretty good, well-balanced package. No one element really kind of overrides the others. It certainly has some very annoying things about it, like the lack of the temperature gauge and the decontenting compared to the previous model, so Honda and Acura could make more of a room for the Integra, which is basically just a Civic Si under the skin, but much more expensive. But overall, I guess it's a pretty good car, though it does not raise your pulse the way older Honda models do. So as a Honda fanboy, it pains me to say this. The new Civic Si is a good car, just not a great one. Alright guys, I think that's all I got for this one. My name is Jake. You've been watching Drive, Brake, Fix, Repeat. I'll see you guys next time where I go do more fun things with cars. Bye.